create, access, utilize, and share information and knowledge, enabling individuals, communities, and peoples to achieve their full potential in promoting their sustainable development and improving their quality of life, premised on the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and respecting fully and upholding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's a pretty amazing aspirational statement, and it's very difficult to argue against any aspect of it. Making it real is the goal. So as a sort of historical background, the WIS put into place 11 action lines aimed at addressing the goals, and it created the IGF, which we're sitting at today. And this is the last IGF under the current mandate that was created at that particular event. So critical outcome was, in fact, IGF, and the recognition that all sectors would have to work together to achieve the action lines. And there's been these reviews for the past 10 years every year, and that's culminating in December in just about 3 weeks. In a high-level 10-year review that will, in large part, determine the future of this particular conference. I think you've heard about that in previous presentations today. So in 2015, we have to take stock ourselves, and while much progress was made, the Millennium Development Goals were not, in fact, universally achieved. So there's still more work to do. And you can see on the slide up there, and you've got a handout, that there are these 17 new Sustainable Development Goals that have a total of 169 targets. And I won't read them all, but the goal is to see if we can achieve 169 targets that are the measurement of these 17 goals by 2030. Thematically, they break down into people, planet, peace, prosperity, and partnerships, and that's how we're going to have the conversation today. We'll focus first on the people and planet themes, then peace and prosperity, and then on partnerships. So our panel will get a couple of questions to start with and have the opportunity to make an initial intervention. And then we'd like to take questions, comments, and interventions from the floor and try to involve this as a dialogue. So to the first section on people and planet, we have, as far as our original panelists, we have Andrew Wilson from the Center for International Private Enterprise, and he will be our first intervener, and he's coming to us via remote. So Andrew, are you there? Andrew? Andrew is not there. Someone in our remote moderator booth is going to solve this problem. Would you like to go? Huh? Okay. I can see you up there. Oh, I gotta look up.
Yeah, look up. Yeah.
Okay, but we can't hear you.
Okay,
there we go. Andrew, go ahead.
Hi there. I'm sorry, just managed to connect. So if you can update where we are.
Oh, I just introduced you to make your first intervention.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I managed to connect right now then.
All right. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, if looking at the goals of the program of today's issue and talking on issues of people here, a couple of things I'd like to introduce very quickly. One, my organization is the Center for International Private Enterprise. We're part of the U.S. Chamber, and we work on development issues, public-private dialogue, issues around the world. We're sort of the international development arm of the U.S. Chamber. And a couple of things I thought I bring to this, if we're looking at the people aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals, is if you go over and you look at the different goals, I'm going through them. the stuff that really matters to us in really delivering for people through the SDGs, if you look under goal number 1, in particular 1.4, which is about access to basic services for people, or moving on down the line into goal number 16, which is the governance goals, issues dealing with corruption, accountable institutions, and public access to information. To us, these are all important enablers of growth and of providing economic empowerment to people, because if the governance systems in a country don't work well, no matter how much we do to try and promote private sector growth, which is really, if you listen to a lot of the folks at the UN or within the World Bank, private sector growth is going to be the engine of delivering economic growth to people within the SDGs, or the majority of it. And so, excuse me, for us, the governance angle is very important. And I think also recognizing the potential that e-government and technology has to play in leapfrogging governance challenges within governments. So one of the angles we're taking on this, and I hope we'll hear more from some of the other participants later on, is looking at mechanisms that exist to improve the quality of governance and the ability of governments to deliver services to their people. And the Open Government Partnership certainly is one of the angles that plays into this. And we've been pleased to be working with Microsoft and with Thomson Reuters and the government of Korea on setting up a private sector council to work with what's called the Open Government Partnership, which is a public-private partnership in about 64 countries around the world right now, in which civil society and the government sit down together and map out priorities for the government in terms of creating more open access to data, more access to information, and greater transparency within government procedures, so we can also fight things like corruption. The element missing from this has been the private sector. OGP has been going for about 4 years now, 5 years, and the way it's set up is that countries put together partnerships for a 2-year stretch. The government sets some goals, and at the end of the 2 years, the civil society then will evaluate the performance of government towards those goals. But the private sector has been missing from that. And what we've done is we've formed the Private Sector Council on Open Governance. We're with the OGP Secretariat and others to try and bring the private sector into this dialogue, which is very much a development dialogue. Not only in terms of what services and what reforms should the government be undertaking to improve its services and its openness, but also what can the private sector bring to the table to help government reach those goals in terms of expertise, in terms of software applications or other things, to really help government understand the potential that e-government has and the potential synergies that can be built in cooperation with the private sector. Great example of that here in the US, at least, and we can apply this across any other types of sectors, is Amazon, for instance, providing cloud storage for Landsat satellite data, the photographs that people use for satellites to do all sorts of applications. They're storing that for free for the government, and in turn, providing access to anybody who wants to use that data to create applications. You can imagine if we start doing that with healthcare data, with other economic data, with agricultural data, what implications that can have for government planning, but also the private sector to develop programs, products, and services that can help people take advantage of that government data. And I'll just leave it there right now, knowing that we've got some time constraints moving forward.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I can turn now to my left and ask Matthew to give a just brief overview of a successful multi-stakeholder practice that's addressed one of the SDGs, one or more of the SDGs in the people and planet theme.
Thanks, Paul. This is Matthew Shears with the Center for Democracy and Technology. Actually, I'd like to, can I take it back a step? Just kind of, I'd like to build on some of the comments that Andrew made. I think when we're looking at, you mentioned the MDGs and you talked about the WSIS process as the background for this. And I think one of the challenges that we face right now is, and we have faced throughout the MDG process and the linkages to ICTs, is that there really weren't any specific linkages between them. And I made this comment yesterday or the day before, in that what we have before us now between ICTs and the SDGs is a much greater synchronicity between how we can leverage ICTs for delivering on the SDGs and meeting those targets. And so while we may have been somewhat aligned between the WSIS and the MDGs, so the disconnect was there. The action lines that we created were probably more valuable in terms of putting out their guidelines for countries to measure how they were doing, but they were not specific enough, nor were they tied enough to the MDGs to actually provide a real agenda, a real way forward, and a real structure to how we would achieve and meet those targets. So we're in the same situation again, except this time the SDGs have just been approved. So we are in a perfect space to look at the WSIS going forward and say, okay, we come out of the December meeting on the WSIS, we have this new and reinvigorated commitment to ICTs. What's the plan for linking them concretely and substantively to the SDGs? So this has to get beyond merely writing in a declaration that we're going to link the WSIS to the SDGs. This really now is a multi-stakeholder opportunity to make those linkages a reality. So I think that's kind of my first point. The situation is the same, but we have a much greater opportunity to deliver on the potential of ICTs for sustainable development. My second point is that when we're talking about people, and as Andrew kind of touched on, it's about everything at the end of the day. I mean, you know, when I look at the SDGs and I look at the WSIS and they say, so what do we really need at the end of the day? There are 4 issues, I think, that are key, and we can come back to these in more detail. There's the recognition, first and foremost, is the recognition that the realization of one's human rights is absolutely essential and to economic development. If you don't have people who are empowered through the realization of their rights, they don't have an education, they don't have good health care, they don't have the opportunity to get good work. So this is kind of at the core of what of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals are all about, as the Secretary General said, about human dignity. And really the realization of rights is essential. Then you have the affordability and accessibility of ICTs. It's not just about ICTs, it's about how easy we can use them, how easy they are. Do we have digital literacy to support using those ICTs? The next one is about, and Andrew mentioned this, is about governance. It's absolutely essential that we have to have in place good governance systems and the rule of law, so there's a predictability not only for business, but there's predictability for the empowerment of people and their rights as well. And then the last one I would say is a more general issue that we spend a lot of time talking about, probably more than the others, which is perhaps a little unfortunate, but the importance, the absolute importance of having enabling environments, so that market entry is easy, so that there's competition, so there's good investment climate. So these are all kind of the very fundamental basics that we have to look at when we're talking about empowering people and this concept of how important people are and really realizing their opportunity within the Sustainable Development Goals. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there as a mix of issues that we need to bear in mind. It's not just about talking about multi-stakeholder processes, it's actually much more fundamental. I'd like to hold off on the multi-stakeholder example till a little later because it's very specific to policy opportunity. So maybe I'll just leave it there and see if anyone else wants to jump in. Thanks.
Okay, then I will flip over to my right and introduce Josie from the OECD and ask you if you'd like to intervene on anything Matthew said or Andrew has said or on the general multi-stakeholder process.
Yeah, actually, just following on your last point, in regards to the multi-stakeholder process being more than just a process, I think that the OECD definitely recognizes that, and we've institutionalized how we engage with stakeholders. So early on, in I think it's 1962, we actually formally created the Business and Industry Advisory Committee and then the Trade Union Advisory Committee to formally engage with us at various committee meetings on specific subjects. In the space of digital economy, so how we create policies for innovation, growth, and social prosperity in these areas, we've recognized that it was even more important to have the internet technical community and civil society. So we also formalized that engagement as well. So we have bodies that sit at all of our meetings that represent both of those stakeholder groups. And it's not just about attending the meetings, but they're engaged in every aspect of the process. So whether we're developing new council recommendations that become guidances for government policy or for organizational policies, all of these groups have an equal say as the governments that sit around the table as well. And we think that, especially in the digital space, that this is fundamental to ensuring that what we're doing is going to benefit the growth of the digital economy, and that, you know, policies are going to be interoperable and relevant to different organizations, including business. So yeah, I absolutely support that last remark. Thanks.
And to my left, Anki Das from Facebook.
So I think just building that forward in terms of talking about the partnerships frameworks which industry is sort of working on in terms of making sure that some of this multi-stakeholder principles are brought into addressing we see this most actively being implemented in the areas of addressing questions of building access, because that really requires the participation of multiple stakeholders, whether it is industry and private sector on one hand, to government, which has to, sort of engage in multi-stakeholder process for policy making, as well as users and consumers on the other side. There is a stakeholder voice on every side, which is going around. Industry's role is very important in this, because as a key mover in terms of making the investments in the sector, whether it's on the last mile infrastructure side or also in terms of creation of services and applications, whether it's the startup ecosystem or the small local content developer or an SME which is engaged in this area of creating relevant goods and services in this area. These are all ecosystem plays which are coming together, and all of them have to have a voice in terms of how policy making is done on the access side, so that the burdens which can sometimes be a consequence of unilateral policy making, that does create a degree of burdens on the innovation cycle in terms of just making sure how enterprise or the private sector or even civil society is engaging with those processes. What we've seen in terms of taking the SDG goals, if you look at it from implementable country level planning, there are, in the South Asia region, for instance, we're just seeing this momentum of various countries, whether it's India or Bangladesh or even Pakistan, they're all coming up with this digital roadmap. So in India, you have the Digital India Blueprint, which actually is mapping onto a lot of the SDGs in terms of making sure that citizen services are available from government, in terms of spectrum delicensing, having robust multi-stakeholder processes in terms of just having conversation with the last mile access infrastructure provider. Similarly, in Bangladesh also, we are seeing similar kind of country plans being built, which are at a design level incorporating all these consultation processes, where everybody has a seat on the table and is contributing effectively in terms of the policy making architecture.
Thank you. Before I go any further, I just would like to open it up to the floor if anyone has a comment that they would like to make. Anyone? Okay, if not, then I'll go back around Robin again and back to Andrew. And Andrew, if you're still there, you look like a list of 17 squares to me at the moment. But if you're still there, I wonder if you could give a little bit of an outline of a particular project and that you have been involved in or have seen put into place that has resulted in some actual change in one or more of the SDG related topics.
Well, we certainly do a lot of work on public-private dialogue around the world, and I think one of the things that I'd like to comment on first before moving forward is that what we find when you try to have sort of public-private stakeholder dialogue in many countries, and in particular in a lot of emerging markets, is that it's often an unequal dialogue. The private sector itself is often poorly prepared to organize its collective opinion, to provide thoughtful input, prioritized input to government officials. And quite often government officials, to be honest, aren't really well prepared to enter into dialogue with the private sector. In a lot of places, these types of relationships, these types of productive dialogues are not second nature to people. And there's a big trust issue that needs to be overcome in order to make that sort of thing happen. You know, the way we approach this when we're working with partners in emerging markets is to really sort of focus on the process to a certain extent. You know, what do you do before you get to the table? How do you talk to either, if you're an association or a representative body, your membership? How do you get a good, strong sense of what they need and how to move forward? Then how do you enter into a constructive dialogue with policymakers? And then what we do find is that once that relationship of trust is established, and policymakers realize that there's a win-win relationship at hand, quite often you'll see quite a bit of impact from these public-private dialogues. You know, in Pakistan, for instance, for our South Asian colleague, we worked a lot with the Pakistan Association of Software Houses on a sort of a sectoral business agenda for the IT sector in Pakistan. You know, how, in addition to the usual issues of, say, intellectual property, how do you encourage the growth of a domestic IT sector? In the case of Pakistan, one of the big issues that was at play was how can you collateralize thought, or, you know, intangible product? Companies couldn't get loans from banks because of the central bank regulation was so tight on them that they couldn't use their intellectual property as collateral. In a place like Bangladesh, we've worked a lot with women and women's business groups, the Bangladesh Women's Chamber of Commerce, for instance, on issues like access to credit. You know, women, small businesses, micro businesses. You know, micro businesses can do micro loans. Small businesses were having a lot of problems getting bank loans, again, due to central bank regulation and whatnot. Women were having problems coming up with the collateral requirements that were required. Banks weren't interested in working with women entrepreneurs and providing them funds for their small businesses. And we did work, the BWCCI did work with its membership of about 5,000 small businesses across Bangladesh, and were able to successfully work in partnership and advocate to the government to put in place changes to the central bank regulations that made it easier for women to get a bank loan, and then further on for banks to actually create positions within branches focused solely on providing credit to women-owned businesses. So there were people within the banks whose job it was to start doing that. Again, that's working at the policy level, the top level of the environment. And these problems weren't being solved until these associations and these groups got what they needed in terms of the abilities and the skills to talk to their membership and figure out how to advocate effectively, and then to be able to go to government with a solid plan in their hands to say, this is what we want, this is what we need, and this is the time frame we'd like to have it in. And we've seen concrete results in both types of environments, and you see this all over the world in different approaches.
So turning to you folks out in the audience, I wonder if any of you have been involved in a particular project, either, you know, building out some infrastructure, solving an application problem, realizing some attainment of health outcomes, or some other project using ICTs that required you to work at a collaborative cross-sector environment as Andrew's just described. Anyone? You are a quiet group. Well, so yes, it's the lunch thing. So in the main session this morning, There was a lot of discussion about how funding needed to be made available in order to create applications and services that were in local languages or that would meet the needs in developing market communities. One of the ideas that was floated was the idea of essentially an affirmative action program for applications and services. There were a couple of other ideas that were at least hinted at regarding taxation or other forms of funding, and then the idea of outright gifts. I wonder if anyone in the audience or here up at the table, or Andrew, if you've been involved, has some thoughts on the funding mechanisms necessary to realize what appears to be an applications and services gap in developing countries relative to sort of local market needs and languages.
Thanks, Paul. I think that one of the challenges that we face, and we saw it through the WSIS process, was the issue of identifying a way of generating funding, but then actually that not at all delivering, and that was the Digital Solidarity Fund. So I think that what that leads us to in terms of a conclusion is that perhaps the traditional funding mechanisms, technology transfer mechanisms are not delivering what we need. And that leads us to a point where we have to say, can we think about new ways, new innovative financing mechanisms, new innovative ways of funding? And some of this is incredibly important, because when you think about the SDGs 1 through 6, these are fundamental SDGs that really, the ability to address these and the ability to know and to tailor to the individual country level challenges will rest with country level approaches in many times. And this means that you have a challenge, because what you need to do is then ensure that the local country has and the sufficient innovation and entrepreneurship to be able to identify what some of those challenges are and to be able to identify locally appropriate solutions to them. And I think this is an area which really lends itself to thinking differently about financing and funding. And I think that perhaps there are techniques that have been used elsewhere to stimulate innovators and to stimulate entrepreneurship that can be used similarly to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship at the local level, to really look at some local solutions to some of these sustainable development challenges. So I think my suggestion in that regard would be that we really do need to expand our horizon in terms of financing and funding approaches, and really think about it far more innovatively and far more beyond the traditional sorts of donors or funders. Thanks.
Did that stimulate any thoughts from anyone in the crowd? Yes, we have a winner.
Hello. I think the government and the companies has to founding the university. We have a lot of students who knows do something, who are into the community, and so they knew the problems, and they know how to solve them, but they don't have money to do that. And it's difficult to ask money, you know. Now we have some forms to do that. It's like a website, crowdfunding, but your idea have to be so good to people give the money. And I don't know. It's something like that.
So this is an access to capital issue, I think, the way you just described it. And by the way, when you speak, if you could just identify who you are, so if everybody can know you and take the benefit of that. But so access to funding, and what I heard you say was that it's particularly for students who will have the ideas and potentially understand the way to make a solution, but don't have the funding in order to be able to do it. And you mentioned potential mechanism like crowdsourcing or crowdfunding, but the bar to getting a successful crowd-funded operation seems to be particularly high. And I wonder whether there's people in the audience here today who've had experience with unique methods of funding for new applications and services, particularly crowdfunding, or new ways of accessing venture cash that would like to chime in. Okay, so no takers on that one. I'd like to turn to Anki Das at Facebook now, because Facebook's been involved recently in a number of projects aimed specifically at trying to address the needs of people in developing markets and treating those markets as unique. And I would wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about how those have come together and the partnerships involved.
Yeah, I think our strategy of looking at this has really been the partnerships model, and overall at the highest level, I mean, I'll summarize it under our Internet.org program, which was launched last year and has been now scaled to various countries. And essentially, the hypothesis is that there are 3 barriers to connectivity, which we see. One is the first one is that it's just a pure access point. There is no last mile access infrastructure in many parts of the world. The 4 billion people who are not connected, it just doesn't exist. And that will require tremendous investments by lots and lots of people. So there definitely needs to be, sort of thoughtful strategies in terms of working with access infrastructure providers, as well as looking at other alternative technologies like drones, UAVs, etc., and other satellite-based communications to provide the requirements of last mile access. Then there is this entire thing of affordability. There is asymmetry in sort of purchasing parity which exists between the developed world and the developing world. And clearly, I mean, that needs to be addressed. There is a very real affordability challenge which needs to be addressed in a lot of these countries. And the third element is that even when people come online and get access to the internet, there is the point about relevance and awareness. What do you do? Because it's not as intuitive as voice, and therefore just making sure that people have awareness in terms of what does digital literacy really do, what are the kinds of applications and services which can be accessible to people who are coming onto the internet for the first time. And our Internet.org is a comprehensive strategy to address all of those. So at the access infrastructure side, we of course are partnering with the entire community of telecom operators, because those are the guys who are going and building out networks. We're also looking at underserved areas where telecom operators traditionally have not laid down any networks or not made investments in terms of lighting up those areas. And those areas then become important areas for us to look at in terms of looking at alternate technologies such as satellites, such as UAVs, etc. And we're making investments in those areas. You may have read that we recently announced in a couple of weeks back, or about a month now, a partnership with Utelesat to provide satellite connectivity in 18 countries in Africa. And also we are in a very early test phase in terms of completing the first test cycle of our UAVs. It's a plane which has been flying for the last 2 months, and hopefully it'll fly for another month and then it'll be grounded. So we would have tested the model, right, like that this thing actually works, and then figure out that what is the deployment strategy in terms of scaling it to further underserved or unconnected areas. So it's a lot of cutting edge innovation and work which is happening there in our connectivity labs on that. Then there is this entire piece around affordability and awareness, which is why we have Free Basics, our Free Basics program, which is an on-ramp to the full internet. This basically is an open platform accessible to any developer to build a thin layer of application on, so that it can be available to everybody who's accessing the internet for free. And we've already launched this program, the Free Basics programs, in 25 countries. For example, in countries like Philippines, we've launched, it's a non-exclusive program. The three key characteristics of this program: it's not exclusive to any operator. In an ideal world, we would like all operators to provide that. In Philippines, there are 2 operators who are providing that. And then it is open to all developers to build on that, and it's free. It's, as you know, these are two-sided markets. There are users on one side, content developers on the other side, and it is free to both. From the time that it has been launched, it has brought 15 million people online, which is, I mean, it's an incremental number, but it's still a noticeably a big number, and the program has been around only for a limited period of time. As we scale the program and as we talk to more operators and figure out ways and means of getting more and more operators to provide that, I think this will be a good way of bringing more and more people online. So those are the types of things which Facebook is doing, and of course, doing this in a partnership framework where we're partnering with satellite companies, telecom operators, and of course the entire developer ecosystem, including new startups, etc., to onboard services.
I'm going to go back to my right, to Josie now. What Anki just talked about was a lot of innovation and a lot of risk, actually, in terms of experimenting with new technologies and new ways of delivering things, and in fact, even, although you didn't mention it, experimenting with some things that are potentially politically sensitive around what constitutes the internet and access. And I wonder, from a perspective of the OECD, how you would think about risk-taking in management and sort of forward imagining for projects like this.
Okay, so in terms of a lot of the work that the OECD does, I mean, obviously we are made up of 34 member countries that are in a very different situation than emerging nations. But because of the nature, particularly in our area of digital, of the policies we're working with, we have to reach out to other non-member countries in order to be able to implement or move forward, I guess, with our policy making. So just, this is a little bit of a sidebar to what we were discussing, but just to show that we have this additional engagement. Part of what the OECD offers is a forum for countries to get together and share best practices and ideas. And we do that by within our own membership, obviously, with our stakeholders, the 4 groups that I previously mentioned, as well as inviting non-members to engage with us, and especially in the area of digital policy making. So, for example, we have a ministerial meeting coming up next June in Cancun, Mexico, and we have invited 19 non-member countries as a part of this dialogue. And one of the issues we will be looking at is trust and risk. We really have this new way of thinking and of looking at risk from a risk-based management approach. So for example, we just recently revised the 2002 security guidelines, which was an extensive process that was undertaken, and it was a multi-stakeholder process. We believe that the inclusion and openness of these discussions is the way that we're going to get our policies implemented, as well as to move forward with projects of varying types, whether that be for connectivity or for digital innovation or new business models or any type of growth. In terms of the process that we followed for our revision, we had an open call for input, so stakeholders were allowed to provide whatever feedback they wanted to in a very open manner. There was no formality to it. And once that was collected, the decision was made that we were going to undertake a more formal process. And as part of this formal process, the, again, previously identified stakeholder groups, which we call, for acronym purposes, we call BAC, TUAC, CSAC, and ITAC, all of the stakeholder views are channeled through them. So they're actually established entities where all of the business community that wants to be represented provides their viewpoint to the focal point in BIAC, and then that is shared at the table during the discussions. And that includes detailed input such as wordsmithing what should become part of the guidelines, recommendations, and policy principles. In the case of these digital security initiative, we had a new recommendation that was just released this fall. It was approved by our council. The formal name is the OECD Recommendation on Digital Security Risk Management for Economic and Social Prosperity. And really, we couldn't have done it without the input of stakeholders. And these types of policy principles and guidelines are used mostly by governments and in some cases business and organizations to develop their own regulations and laws that are common and that are more interoperable and that are all based on the same fundamental principles that have been agreed to by the stakeholders, the governments, and those non-members that choose to sign on to that. So,
I just want to check and make sure that if we have any additional remote participants or anyone who would like to intervene. Is that a yes or a no? There you are. Hi.
Hi there. Yeah, this is Andrew. I just had a comment I'd like to make, sort of going back to the broader comments that Anki was making in terms of, putting together some sort of an ecosystem for this. And it is a challenge in a lot of emerging markets, developing countries, not just for the tech sector and developing applications, but just in general in starting a business. And I think it's only compounded for people who are in an industry that requires a higher level of infrastructure and support. But if the basic laws and regulations and practices aren't in place just to help somebody put a legal framework around their activity so they can go out and get a business loan, or they can go bankrupt in the end and not be thrown in jail as a debtor. If countries aren't addressing those basic entrepreneurship issues as part of the overall landscape of ecosystems, then I think that there are so many barriers that exist that it makes it even more difficult for people who want to develop in the tech sector to do so in country. I think of a group I knew in Pakistan who were developing just gaming software, and they had developed a cricket game software that they wouldn't sell in Pakistan. So all the work was being done in Pakistan, but they wouldn't sell the software in Pakistan because the intellectual property wasn't going to be protected in the country. They were selling it in Australia and other parts of the world, but they wouldn't sell their own product in their own country. So if you've got systems like that that are hostile to intellectual property, that are hostile to business setup, establishment, that don't provide even basic business skill training and support, if you don't deal with those basic foundations of entrepreneurship, it's going to be a lot more difficult, even with the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure platforms in place, to encourage those types of startups to exist. People will immigrate to countries where they can do startups. They'll leave a market if they're true entrepreneurs, if the barriers are too high. And this is a discussion we've been having with the broader entrepreneurship community. And there used to be a stream of thought which said entrepreneurs will always find a way to survive. They're naturally born strugglers. They've got great ideas, and they can always make it work. And over the last few years, people, I think, are starting to come around to the idea, well, maybe that's not quite true. Maybe there are barriers in place that even a hardened entrepreneur can't crack. And Lord help you if you're just coming out of university or college with some great bright ideas and trying to enter into that sort of situation. So we do really need to pay attention to those broader questions of just, can you do business in a country as a micro or small business entrepreneur, before we even get to the questions of are the right platforms in place. Thank you.
And I'll turn back to Matthew.
Actually, I'd like to pick up on a couple of points, particularly the one about ecosystems and partnerships. In trying to contribute to achieving the targets for the SDGs, we're going to have to think differently as stakeholders. We're going to have to think holistically. We're going to have to think about partnerships across stakeholders, and we're going to have to think about ecosystems generally, because there's absolutely no way that we'll be able to meet these targets and solve these problems if we don't do that. And it's been too easy in the past to actually kind of look at these challenges from a stakeholder perspective, from a business perspective, or from a human rights perspective, or from a from a small and medium-sized business perspective. So I think it's time that actually we realize the challenge, that we realize that we have to reach out and we have to work across stakeholders. And in many ways, we almost need to do what we do with the national and regional IGFs, but more broadly. Perhaps we need IGFs for reaching and contributing to sustainable development goals. Because when you think of the organizations come together in these regional IGFs, national IGFs, and here, you've got all the stakeholders. You've got all the stakeholders that are necessary for addressing some of these things, and for certainly for ensuring that ICTs are a fundamental enabler of meeting those targets. So let's think a little bit more broadly. Let's think about creating, we don't have to create new IGS, but let's think about taking that model and say, okay, we have a challenge. We have a clean water challenge. We have a fundamental education challenge. Let's take that same kind of, call it multi-stakeholder if you will, let's take that same kind of approach, and let's see how we can bring all those stakeholders together to address that challenge. If only from the ICT perspective, but perhaps even more, thinking about it from a more ambitious perspective, which is how do we contribute beyond ICTs? And I think this is a, we tend to think of what we've achieved as regional and national IGFs in somewhat in isolation from the rest of the challenges that countries face. And I think we actually need to think bigger. And what brought that on was your comment about how Facebook is using these networks and these partnerships to build this kind of ecosystem. And that ecosystem is going to be absolutely essential. And I think it's going to take governments working across agencies, which they don't necessarily typically do. It's going to take businesses reaching out and funding on innovators locally. It's going to take civil society stepping up and saying, we need to talk about the education system. We need to talk about capacity building. So it's just taking what we know and what we love about this environment and the experiences that we have from this, and let's think about them a little bit more broadly. What more can we do with this model? And I think that's really the kind of taking that multi-stakeholder model, which is really what we're kind of talking about here, and thinking, okay, where else can we use this? What can we do with this beyond just ICTs? Or at a minimum, how can we do it with ICTs to underpin meeting the targets for the SDGs? Thanks.
On questions, as you said, basically all the stakeholders are here, right? And so the question would be, if all the stakeholders are here to solve these problems, then what is the impediment to their being solved? Why is that not actually happening?
What was really interesting before I came into this panel was I said, okay, I'd really like to figure out what was the impact and the value of the regional and national IGFs. And having been to a number of them, I can see on the ground the impact and the value. But what was really stunning was when I went on the Internet Governance Forum site and tried to actually find an analysis of what the value and impact is, it really wasn't that clear. So I think we're missing something there in terms of even realizing our own potential. And then there's the factor of trust. And this is where stakeholders have to be able to move beyond their own single stakeholder space and start to reach out and build levels of trust, because that's the only way that that's going to work. And that is a whole nother discussion, but that's probably the biggest challenge, I would say, to solving some of these challenges. But that requires us stepping out of our stakeholder groups as well. And so working in partnerships, working across stakeholders. And I think there's opportunity there, and we don't want to miss it.
Comments from the floor? Or remote participation?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. I'm just intervening here on behalf of one of the panelists, remote panelists who couldn't unfortunately make it due to technical issues, that he has sent through a comment which I will read out. The panelist Segun Olugbile, who is with the Continental Project Affairs Associate and a founding member of the Nigeria IGF, sent through this following comment. On the subject of how can the internet help enable open governance in developing nations, he's written, in terms of the overview of Mdg Challenges, Key sources of setback of MDGs included both domestic and external developments, such as sudden increases in global food and energy prices, as well as global financial downturns, which adversely impact domestic food inflation. On the domestic scene, the challenges have included rising unemployment, high income inequality, and rapid population expansion. For instance, in developing nations such as Nigeria, unemployment has remained one of Nigeria's most challenging socioeconomic burdens. The poverty situation is underpinned by the high national unemployment rate, estimated at 23.90% in 2011. In order to reduce poverty and unemployment, economic progress must outpace demographic expansion in a progressive manner. But the inability of economic expansion and employment-generating interventions to catch up with over 1.8 million new entrants into the job market every year pose a major challenge to poverty reduction efforts in the country. So moving forward to sustainable development, a new universal agenda which seeks to address what the SDGs could achieve requires a new framework for good governance. Good governance is essentially imperative for laying the foundations for sustainable development. Good governance stimulates positive development. However, for good governance to achieve this outcome, it requires citizens' cooperation and multi-stakeholder engagement in policy process and economic interventions. Open governance offers a new multi-stakeholder approach to delivering good government. The framework of open government is anchored on the whole of the nation being included in a government that is open, transparent, and accountable. Thus, the Internet plays a key role to help facilitate multi-stakeholder convergence for good governance. It provides us that technology intervention necessary for us to enable active engagement of stakeholders in policy processes. It connects us, enables us, activates us, and so much more, provides us with a local but universal space to help share our voice, communicate, and contact leaders in government about our feelings on discrepancy in economic development. Therefore, considering the SDG statement of principles on prosperity, which says we are determined to ensure that all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives, and that economic, social, and technological progress occurs in harmony with nature. Sustainable development will be a visionless statement agenda if critical Internet governance issues are not continually addressed. Issues such as access, trust, Internet resources, online freedom of expression, privacy, and broadband connectivity, there are those issues of disparity amongst nations. And finally, we look forward towards commencing the operation of these new goals and targets, which will come into effect on the 1st of January 2016 and will guide decisions we take over the next 15 years. And we must ensure the Internet and good governance are central to the success of these goals. That is the end of the comment. And there are two other very short comments which Segun has sent through and which I can intervene at a later stage at the relevant moment to make those two. Thank you.
Okay. I think I saw one other hand up when I asked last time. Was there? Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just very briefly, those are wonderful comments. And I would note that just as a part of the SDG process, a preparatory process, the United Nations commissioned a survey called the Million Voices Survey, or the Million Voices Report. And one of the most important outcomes or kind of key takeaways from that report was the fact that good governance was absolutely essential to meeting the SDGs. So I just want to put that in there as this is a big challenge, as was outlined, but that's a key challenge, and everybody knows it's a challenge. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else in the room that would like to intervene or come in on the last comments? Okay. Then I'm going to go back to my right and ask Josie to talk just a little bit more about how the decision-making process works in the multi-stakeholder model that you work in. You described it a little bit, but one of the things that I take away from it is that it is a very ordered process that has that seems to have rules. It has setup. It has process by which consensus is achieved. process by which it's not. And as I was listening to Anki talk about her projects, which also involve multiple stakeholders, they also have a variety of processes and a different process, but also process. And there's two different examples of multi-stakeholderism that I'd like to try to plow through.
Given the fact that we are an international organization, we are guided by a convention. So due to that, we are a little bit probably more formalized than other types of multi-stakeholder participation. And the OECD is consensus-based. So it's not really a voting institution. It really is a dialogue that happens among countries to agree upon guidelines, principles, recommendations, etc., declarations, tools that we use, as I mentioned previously, to build government policies, regulations, legislation in the end. In terms of the other participants and stakeholders, they sit at the table like all the countries. They have an equal say. They participate in a manner that is equivalent to the member countries. As I mentioned, though, they do, in a diversified group, for example, like civil society, where you are going to have different types of civil society, they do have to reach a consensus of some sort amongst themselves before they come to the table. So we only have one voice speaking at that time. However, when we're having meetings, usually these discussions are based on papers, or in the case of a recommendation, the actual text that needs to be debated. And we also accept written comments. So we get a lot of different viewpoints through both a written process as well as a verbal process. And in addition to the papers, we hold workshops and forums, ministerial meetings. We have a number of interactive type dialogues that will happen in the course of a process in order to achieve whatever it is that the objective that we're trying to achieve. So while we do have formality around it, it is still an open conversation where we welcome a variety of different viewpoints, and we try to engage in an open manner so that we do understand the viewpoints that we're getting from the different stakeholder communities and the governments as well, because despite the fact that we are a membership of developed countries, we do have differing viewpoints in terms of the types of policies and directions that we want to take, particularly when it comes to implementing it within our own countries. So.
Just to clarify, in the end, it's a consensus process, but it's a consensus among governments informed by consensus amongst stakeholders.
So if it's an official tool that ultimately gets produced, so a council recommendation or a declaration, then it does have to go through the formal OECD Council. And Council is made up of only the member countries. It's an ambassador that represents each of the member countries that then takes the final decision. But up until that point, it is a consensus of the member countries, any non-member that has been invited to participate or has requested to participate, and the 4 stakeholder groups.
Okay, thanks. So now I want to turn to Anki to talk a little bit more about the multi-stakeholder process that you've used.
I think where it is absolutely imperative to have multi-stakeholder process more than other areas. I mean, we discussed the partnership framework, but I think where it's absolutely critical to have multi-stakeholder processes where there is regulatory vacuum, and a lot of this innovation spaces, they, as you know, they flourish when there is ambiguity. That's the nature of the beast, and we need to sort of very seriously apply ourselves to the question of role of governments in that, because typically what we've found that when it comes to solving the SDG problems, governments obviously have an important role there, but when it is compounded with this element of regulatory vacuum, particularly when high-paced innovation is happening in high technology sectors which are trying to solve these problems, there is no stated law, and therefore, at one level it fuels innovation because there is no codification as such, and that kind of regulatory vacuum is helpful to high-paced innovation because it unleashes enterprise, and that it helps platforms and networks to be formed. But at the same time, it also creates this concerns that a lot of that may be a speed breaker may be put on that because governments may act unilaterally, and in a lot of the developing countries, it's not very clear as to what is this input-output process going to be from a multi-stakeholder principles perspective. How do you design the framework in terms of the consultation? What is the obligation on governments when they receive input from various stakeholders to publish how they arrived at certain outputs? Very often there is a high degree of opacity in terms of how those decision-making processes work. Also, it is not very clear as to if there has been an iterative movement of a particular decision, how that has moved along. So I think the main thing which we also need to be concerned about and also engage as part of this multi-stakeholder framework is that and I think it's a global problem, but more acute in developing countries and in the global south, where it's a capacity issue, but also, there is global regulatory vacuum in a lot of these questions. There's no settled precedent there. What gets compounded is that when you get down to country levels is that the design in terms of the multi-stakeholder consultation process itself, it's not developed. And therefore, what you talked about, Matthew, the role of the national, the convening, sort of the power of the national and the regional IGFs just become a very important framework to be able to provide that ambience so that people can come together and have these discussions in a very open and democratic way, which if that were not to exist, I don't know that there would be appropriate pressure points in terms of getting those governments to really open up and having those conversations.
Good. Matthew, do you have comments on that?
So I think the notion of regulatory vacuum and encouraging a multi-stakeholder approach to that is a very good one. So the model that I'm going to suggest to you is a model for multi-stakeholder, I would call it multi-stakeholder regulatory shaping rather than decision-taking or development, is one that builds trust between stakeholders and governments, which, as we've been talking about, is incredibly important. And this is a model in which there is a recognition that obviously the decision-making rests with government, but that the value of interacting with stakeholders is such that the expertise that's brought to the table will shape what the government is hopefully going to do vis-a-vis a regulatory response. So I'm going to give you an example, an actual example, and if you're interested in that, I can point you to more material on it. I'm a member of the UK government's multi-stakeholder advisory group on internet governance, which is called MAGIG, M-A-G-I-G for short. It is a multi-stakeholder entity, about 30 representatives from business, from civil society, and it is led by the UK government. It is a tool for building trust between stakeholders. It's also a tool for encouraging a wide-ranging discussion and deliberation on a whole host of regulatory and policy issues. It was set up in 2013. It's got, as I said, 30 members. And I'll just read the first principle because I think it's quite telling. The first principle, or terms of reference for the MAGIG is to work in collaborative spirit to contribute to UK inputs into major conferences and meetings relating to international internet governance and telecommunication issues on a Chatham House basis. So the issues that we've talked about in the MAGIG, and I can tell you that the deliberations we've had in the MAGIG have shaped UK policy in these areas, have been on issues as important as the ITU plenipotentiary and the preparatory work for that. In fact, at the recent plenipotentiary, members of the MAGIG who were not government representatives actually took the floor and represented the UK government in those meetings. We've also talked extensively about the WSIS process, and the process leading up to the discussions we've been having here and onwards into December, and on the ICANN accountability and IANA transition issues. So these are very substantial policy issues in the international internet governance space, and I can say, because I'm a member of this group, that our views have been taken into account. Now, that's a first step, but obviously it's a very important first step, and if there aren't such structures or entities in your respective countries, this is an easy step for governments to take to bring stakeholders to the table. And there's plenty of guidance out there as to this model or other models, but I think it's a very important thing for building the issue of trust, and it's a very important thing for hearing stakeholders, and particularly civil society voices, on policy issues, because we're usually the last stakeholder to be invited to those discussions. So these kind of initiatives are key. So if you're thinking about how do we engage in the WSIS process on ICTs for SDGs, these are the kind of proposals to make. You go to your government, you say, we've got this process. We need to engage across stakeholders to talk about the SDGs. Let's follow this kind of a model or something similar. And I think this is a small step, big trust building, and opportunity to input on policy. And I think it's the kind of model that we should be looking to promote if it doesn't already exist.
Andrew, do you have a comment? And if not, I'll take the other two remote comments that came in, and then I see a hand right there in the middle of the back row. So.
Yeah, I wanted just to a couple of comments. One to Anki's comment about being able to work in sort of a policy vacuum area where there aren't established interests in government, and I think she's spot on. I think in terms of sectors where there aren't long established interest groups, it's a lot easier to have these kinds of dialogues. And I really am supportive of the multi-stakeholder approach that Michael put forward. I would say, though, that in our experience, jumping into these dialogues in sort of underdeveloped democracies, and I'm using the democracy term here, is more difficult than it seems. Governments in a lot of places, in a lot of emerging democracies, are not well accustomed to multi-stakeholder processes. If I look at the OGP experience that we've witnessed, which is, you know, across a variety of democratically oriented countries, you know, OGP itself is supposed to be based on a multi-stakeholder dialogue. Civil society and government are to sit down at the beginning of a process, put together a map and a consultative process, and then government goes away for 2 years, does implementation, and civil society is supposed to be there to monitor it. Well, if you look at OGP's own internal statistics, which were brought out a couple of weeks ago in Mexico City at their ministerial meeting, only about 25 to 27% of governments are actually having some type of stakeholder dialogue. And this is in a framework that is designed to be based around stakeholder dialogue. And if you talk to the NGOs involved, civil society that's involved in these dialogues, often the quality of these dialogues where they do exist is poor. And this is an issue that I think a lot of comes back to trust in a sense, where the private sector might show up for a dialogue or some sort of consultative process, civil society might show up, and the government's almost often preordained the conclusion. It's already written the paper, and what it's looking for is more support for its own views than it is for something that's really starting at a grassroots level and building dialogue over you know, a longer kind of dialectic process, if you will. So it's getting governments into the habit of not coming to the table already with their list in hand and coming in listening mode before they start writing the papers, and along, you know, like such as the OECD process. Very difficult in practice to put in place, and a lot of work needs to be done to acclimatize government officials to take this approach, and also to the private sector and other stakeholders to be able to participate in a productive way. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a hand at the back of the room. When there's a roving mic.
Hi, thank you. Anja Mier from the Center on Governance through Human Rights in Berlin. I have a little bit of a provocative question, because following the multi-stakeholder approach for quite some years and seeing how this is sort of spreading around the world and even in, let's say, less democratic countries. And I'm wondering, by the examples you were giving, whether this is just a different name really for what we've always experienced the last 30, 40 years for having consultancies with NGOs, with stakeholders, with agencies that implement later the work. Governments have always been selective in whom they choose to sit on their tables. We have parliamentarian hearings where we have, you know, sort of a multi-stakeholder approach since 100 years. It's so nothing new, let me put it this way. And I'm a bit afraid that the potential that was in this whole multi-stakeholder approach when it started, to that not stakeholders or different stakeholders sit on the table and consult and advise and discuss with governments, but later they also take their shared responsibility when implementing. But they also can hold governments more accountable. So this mutual accountability that could come into the game, that this sort of vaporizes in this debate. Because what you were explaining, I can see it everywhere flourishing. Yes, governments, they need NGOs, they need external agencies to do their job. So, and I fear a bit that we just put the name multi-stakeholder on it to get the job done, and the credit again is taken by the governments at the end. You know, this is consciously a little bit provocative, but I'm just wondering what you could respond to this.
Okay, we'll take the other two remotes, and then anybody else with hand, and then we'll try to respond. Okay.
Hello?
Yep.
Hi, I'm sorry, I was actually trying to summarize the question of the audience member there for the remote participants, because unfortunately they couldn't hear it, so I just missed what you said. If you'd like me to intervene with the intervention of Segun, though, I'm happy to do that. It relates to an example of successful citizen intervention using an open e-platform. But I'm not sure this is the right time to do that.
It's probably this time or no time if we're going to put it on the record.
Okay, then I'll do that. This example is of a successful story of a citizen intervention on open budget aided by the use of the internet. So a local open budget intervention through the use of the internet called Budg IT, Budg IT initiative, was conceptualized by young Nigerians and hacked at the Tech in Governance, a 48-hour gathering organized by Co-Creation Hub in February 2011. Budg IT as a tool aims to redefine participatory governance. Many Nigerians with little or no knowledge of accounting and public financial management are lost when they see, if they ever get the chance to, the budgets of the different arms of government. Most media releases of the Nigerian budget only have the macro figures, as the finer details that trickle down to the citizens, such as neighborhood projects, are not fully explained. The maze of millions and billions in the thick budget documents tend to confuse, and it is difficult to put clear context on how public funds are actually spent. Budg IT's innovation within the public circles comes with a creative use of government data by either presenting them in simple tweets, interactive formats, or infographic displays. It is believed that in a democracy, every citizen has the right to know his or her taxes are expended in the delivery of public infrastructure and services. Equality and open access to governance is entrenched in democracy and its institutions, and as such, budgetary information as a vital asset needs to be understandable and accessible to all Nigerians. This initiative, supported by many partners, offers mobile and online intervention to trigger discussions around the budget and take the budget beyond a news item to a focal point of debate among Nigerians. It is indeed working and made possible through the effective use of the internet.
Thank you. And then there was another hand up, green shirt in the middle and white shirt closer to the back.
Thank you. I'm Liana Galsian from ISOC Armenia, ISOC ambassador. I just wanted to share about the multi-stakeholder model, what we exercise in Armenia. We have council. We have formed a council which is called Internet Governance Council, and it is an advisory body. And we do include all the stakeholders there. So we have, you said that it is very difficult to bring to the table then civil society and all the other sectors. In fact, in this council, we do have all these voices collected, and we do what is essential about this council is that it will work throughout the year. So we do have this IGF thing, which is not once a year, a platform for everyone to speak once a year, but a council which will work throughout the year and will gather all these values, all these interests, and since it is an advisory thing, it will have an impact of bringing or making suggestions to the government of Armenia. So I think that a kind of implications or result will come through this council. So the multi-stakeholder model will work in this case, I hope.
Thanks. And then the one right in front.
Hello, my name is Shrideep Rayamaji, and I'm one of the Internet Society ambassadors. I strongly believe the term multi-stakeholder is more than what we are defining. It's the concept that integrates the bottoms level approach. Previous practice have clearly shown that there was a gap. There is a gap in between what we wanted to do and what was achieved. So, the government, especially if you look at the things about Millennium Goals, if you look at South Asia or those kind of countries, then there was a gap. Stakeholder meant something like the government was choose. Multi-stakeholder is something where it is enforced, right? So all stakeholders would be there. So I think it is the best policy, and it is not just adopted here in the IGF that proves to be well going on, but it will certainly help the SDGs to move on with a greater impact, proving more successful rate, because there will be integration at the lower point as well. So it has more efficiency, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we've actually run out the clock on this particular session. Just a couple of things to sum up, and then I'm going to give each person an opportunity to respond to that one last question, so you can go out with something stimulating in your mind. So we covered a lot of ground. We heard about the successful the idea of ecosystems being required for success. We heard a couple of different models of multi-stakeholder decision making, both on real-world projects and policy documents. We heard about the UK example, which many other governments follow. Similar types of programs. We also heard about impediments, lack of funding, lack of ability to get at funding, lack of sustainability in funding. Affordability came up through many of the interventions. Also the difficulty of organizing particular voices, and Andrew talked about the difficulty initially of organizing a business or private sector voice to be able to be effective, as each of these is being impediments to sort of realizing the full value of multi-stakeholder participation. But we also heard about positive projects that are actually delivering value on the ground. We had several examples of that across the room, and hopefully this has all been useful food for you to be thinking about through the rest of the conference. There was a question in the back which was provocative about whether or not this is just a new label on something old, and I think it does warrant a response. So I'll just go from my right to my left and give each panelist one last word, and then you can have coffee.
Yeah, I like that question. I thought it was a good one. I think it doesn't matter what we label it or how we approach it. I think that it is a step in the right direction, and the recognition that we need different voices around a table in how we develop our policies, our programs, etc. And while we may not have perfected it yet, and speaking from my old job in a national government, yes, frequently we ended up with the usual suspects, as we like to call them, when we consulted on issues. I think it's just very important that the different stakeholder groups continue vocalizing and approaching governments and approaching organizations to ensure that their views are shared. And hopefully, as that continues to happen, and it's more probable in today's environment with all the different ways that you can interconnect with these type of entities, we'll see an evolution in what we're calling multi-stakeholderism. And one little plug, we're having an open forum, the OECD, on Friday, where our stakeholder groups are going to be talking about their perspectives on our upcoming ministerial meetings. So I encourage you to attend that.
I think it was a valid concern, and the biggest thing I think which bothers all of us, I think there is this entire concern that this should not become a self-selection process, right? Like the entire multi-stakeholder model should not get down to, and this is just not the problem of the South. I mean, that's the part of the world I come from, but I think it's a global problem. Like there is this disease, if you will, that it should not become a self-selection process. And therefore, I think particularly when we look at the technology sector, there's something which we have to learn from the startup ecosystem. I think there is that at a design level, we have to see, and that goes even to the IGF, is that there have to be some inbuilt redundancies which we create in terms of either making sure that there is a rotational scheme, and then there is a degree of healthy churn, so that by design you are bringing on newer people. And the startup equivalent of getting more new blood into the conversation. And we have to think about maybe sort of creating appropriate systems or processes, or just having framework. Maybe the open forum is a good way of looking at it, but think about increased frequency of doing stuff like that, so that you're unleashing or creating environments where that kind of startup, finding the startup voices, the equivalent of the startup voices in the multi-stakeholder model is facilitated. And I think we all carry that responsibility to make sure that the principles do not become hostage to a self-selection process.
There is no doubt that we do throw around the term multi-stakeholder with some abandon, and I think that does cause us problems. But on the other hand, it's not that, it's quite a new concept, right? I mean, it's quite a new concept, it's quite a new term, it's a new governance model. It's going to take us time to actually figure out how it works, in what spaces it works, what variations of it work best in what areas, and what policies. So I think, you know, yes, we use it probably too much, but at the same time, I think we still are figuring out how it works, where it works best, and what the models are, and what the approaches are. So I think that we have to give it a little bit more time, but I completely agree. But I'm heartened by the other two comments about, you know, that there are processes underway that are delivering, if only in an advisory capacity. I think that's incredibly important. And of course, to the point of the gentleman there, yes, that is one of the key elements of the multi-stakeholder model, which it is supposed to be by design bottoms up, and that is not something that exists typically in any other governance structure. So I think we need to give it time, but we do need to be wary of how we use it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your coffee.